Acknowledgement of country. I begin today by acknowledging the Turrbal peoples, the traditional custodians of the land on which I present, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Connection to country. Country is everywhere, embracing all aspects of life to which Indigenous Australians have an emotional and spiritual attachment. This perspective is known to influence the way Indigenous Australians deal with environmental issues. Conceptualising Indigenous law. Their approach is immersive and goes beyond dominant Western paradigms of justice and governance to shape and give meaning to all aspects of life, including the relationships between all elements and beings. Clash of ontologies. Western environmental worldviews typically focus on the control and extraction of resources grounded in scientific regulation, whereas Indigenous systems prioritise sustainable resource use, where humans are part of the natural world, not separate to it. This clash of ontologies shapes current challenges. Environmental justice and colonialism. Environmental justice for Indigenous Australians is further tied to the legacies of colonialism, which dispossessed Indigenous Australians of their lands and undermines their traditional practices. Barriers to justice. Further structural barriers, such as restrictive land ownership laws and policy frameworks, continue to prevent the full realisation of Indigenous environmental management, limiting their authority over traditional lands. Extractive industries. The encroachment of mining and other extractive industries on Indigenous lands exemplifies this barrier, as seen in the destruction of Juukan Gorge, which highlights the ongoing injustices faced by many Indigenous communities. This issue is critical for achieving Indigenous environmental justice. The limits of Western environmental governance. Western environmental laws frequently fail to accommodate Indigenous spiritual and cultural practices, limiting the scope of justice for Indigenous environmental management. These laws need to evolve for true equity. Indigenous land management as a legal framework. The recognition of native title, for example, the Mabo case, has incorporated Indigenous land management into legal frameworks, but it's often constrained by Western governance models that overlook Indigenous values. The call for decolonising environmental management. Achieving environmental justice for Indigenous Australians requires decolonising environmental management systems. Empowering Indigenous communities to lead on their own terms is critical. Reclaiming cultural landscapes. Indigenous Australians are increasingly reclaiming their cultural landscapes through traditional ecological knowledge, emphasising a holistic and long-term approach to sustainability. Indigenous-led environmental justice. For Indigenous communities, environmental justice is not just about land restitution, but also about the right to self-determine their land management practices. Their autonomy is key. Legal recognition of Indigenous environmental management. The legal recognition of Indigenous land rights has allowed some traditional management practices to be integrated into broader environmental governance frameworks, though much work remains. Case study, cultural burning and bushfire management. The reintroduction of cultural burning practices in the Cape York Peninsula is a successful example demonstrating the efficacy of Indigenous knowledge in managing fire and landscapes. The role of fire in Indigenous environmental management. Fire management techniques, such as cool burning, are crucial in promoting biodiversity and reducing large-scale bushfires, as practiced by Indigenous land managers. This practice is both ecological and cultural. The role of Indigenous rangers. Indigenous ranger programs, which combine traditional knowledge with scientific methods, is also a key example of a successful Indigenous-led environmental management. These programs empower communities and protect ecosystems. Co-management initiatives. Co-management models, like those in Kakadu National Park, aim to bridge Indigenous knowledge with Western conservation efforts. But true power sharing remains elusive. Equity in these models is still a challenge. Truth-telling and treaty. Truth-telling and treaty negotiations recognising Indigenous rights and sovereignty on their terms can empower communities to manage their lands through traditional practices. This approach fosters environmental stewardship and strengthens the legal basis for Indigenous environmental management and collaborative governance. Collaborative governance as the future. Collaborative environmental governance involving Indigenous and non-Indigenous stakeholders may offer a path toward more equitable and sustainable environmental management. Partnerships hold potential. Cultural coexistence. Cultural coexistence is essential for partnerships that respect differences and allow each worldview to inform practices within its cultural and ecological context. This requires acknowledging environmental impacts and fostering dialogue that promotes a pluralistic understanding of nature, something yet to be fully realised.